Never consider anything as profitable to you that forces you to break your word. Abandon your self-respect or hate, suspect, or curse someone. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations.
The invisible wound. You didn't lose anything today. Nothing broke. Nothing collapsed. And yet something inside you feels hollow. Like you've been standing in a room full of people and somehow, not a single one of them actually saw you. You gave your time. You showed up. You cared. And the return? Silence. Indifference. Or worse, someone else getting the credit, the attention, the appreciation that should have been yours. This isn't about ego. This isn't about being needy. This is about something far more primal, the human need to matter, to be seen, to know that your presence in this world leaves a mark on the people around you. And the most painful part of all, you can't even explain it without feeling like you're complaining about nothing, because nothing technically went wrong. No one insulted you, no one attacked you. They simply looked through you. Marcus Aurelius knew this feeling, not as a philosophical concept, as a lived reality. This was a man who commanded the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and still wrote in his private journal, words he never intended for anyone to read, about the exhausting weight of needing to hold himself together when the world around him refused to meet him where he was. He didn't write those words for history. He wrote them for survival. And what he discovered in that private war between who he was and how the world treated him became one of the most powerful transformations in human history. Not a transformation of power, not of status, but of something that runs far deeper than either of those things. He discovered why people stop being valued, and more importantly, he discovered exactly what changes it. What you're about to hear is not another list of tips. It is not a motivational speech designed to make you feel good for 10 minutes before the feeling fades. This is a precise, uncomfortable, and ultimately liberating examination of the real reason you feel unseen, and the Stoic method that dismantles that feeling at its root. The answer is going to challenge you. It challenged Marcus Aurelius. It challenged Epictetus, a man who built his entire philosophy while living in chains as a slave. It challenged Seneca, who had wealth and power and still wrestled with the same invisible wound you are carrying right now. But on the other side of that challenge, there is something waiting for you that no one can take away. Not indifference, not silence, not the people who looked through you. Stay with this. Chapter 1. The lie you were taught about value. Every piece of advice you have ever received about this problem has been pointing you in the wrong direction, not because the people giving it were malicious, but because they were diagnosing the symptom and completely ignoring the disease. You were told to know your worth. You were told to set boundaries. You were told to walk away from people who don't appreciate you. And you did all of that. Or at least you tried. And here you are, still carrying the same hollow feeling that brought you to this moment. The Stoics would look at that cycle and say something that cuts straight through the noise. You have been trying to solve an internal problem with external solutions, and that never works. Not once. Not ever. Epictetus said it with the kind of precision that only a man who had nothing left to lose could manage. He said that it is not what happens to you that determines your experience of life, but what you believe should happen to you. Read that slowly. Let it land. Because buried inside that sentence is the entire diagnosis. The reason you feel undervalued is not simply that people treat you poorly. It is that somewhere in the foundation of how you see yourself, you constructed your sense of worth on something you were never meant to control. The perception other people have of you. That is not a character flaw. That is conditioning. From the time you were a child, you were measured by external responses. Grades, approval, applause, affection given or withheld based on performance. You learned at a deep and wordless level that your value was something other people decided for you. And you have been living inside that belief ever since, without ever questioning whether it was true. Marcus Aurelius watched this pattern destroy people around him his entire life. Men of talent and intelligence, consumed not by their enemies but by their own need for recognition. He wrote about it with a kind of quiet grief, because he understood that the hunger for external validation is one of the most sophisticated traps a human mind can fall into. It looks like ambition, it feels like motivation, but underneath it, it is fear. The fear that without their approval you are nothing. Here is what the Stoics understood that most people never reach. Value is not something the world assigns to you. It is something you either possess internally, or you do not possess at all. And when you do not possess it internally, no amount of external recognition will ever be enough, because it all passes through a filter that was broken before it even arrived. You can receive a compliment and immediately dismiss it. You can achieve something remarkable and feel empty within hours. You can be surrounded by people who genuinely care about you and still feel profoundly alone. Not because those things are not real, but because none of them can fill a space that only you have the power to fill. This is where the Stoic work begins, not in changing how people treat you, not in finding better people, not in performing a better version of yourself for a more receptive audience. It begins in the one place most people are most afraid to look, directly inside the belief system that has been quietly deciding your worth for as long as you can remember. And that is precisely where we are going next. Chapter 2. The 3 hidden ways you trained people not to value you. This is the part that requires courage. Not the dramatic kind, not the courage of battlefields or impossible decisions, the quiet kind, the kind that asks you to sit with an uncomfortable truth without immediately defending yourself against it. Marcus Aurelius practiced this kind of courage every single morning. Before he spoke to a single advisor, before he read a single dispatch from the front lines of his empire, he sat with himself and asked the hardest question a person can ask. Where am I complicit in my own suffering? That question is the doorway into everything that follows. The world did not simply decide to undervalue you randomly. Patterns this consistent, this persistent, this immune to circumstance, they always have a root. And the Stoics were ruthless about finding roots because they understood that a weed you can see is a weed you can remove. The first way you trained people not to value you is that you made yourself impossible to lose. There is a profound difference between being dependable and being dispensable, and most people who feel undervalued have spent years collapsing that distinction entirely. You were always available. You always said yes. You absorbed inconvenience without complaint and absorbed it again and again until the people around you stopped even registering that they were asking something of you at all. You thought you were demonstrating loyalty. You thought you were showing love. What you were actually doing, without knowing it, without intending it, was training the people around you to expect your presence the way they expect oxygen. Constant, effortless, requiring no acknowledgement whatsoever. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, but he also understood the reverse, that we take for granted most what costs us nothing to have. When your presence, your effort, your time carries no visible weight, no apparent cost, no possibility of absence, it becomes invisible, not because people are cruel, but because the human mind is wired to notice contrast, and you removed all contrast from the equation. The second way you trained people not to value you is that you confused generosity with worthiness. This one runs deep, because it disguises itself as virtue. You gave your energy, your attention, your emotional labor, your time, freely and without condition, because some part of you believed that giving enough would eventually generate the recognition you were searching for. That if you just showed up completely, repeatedly without reservation, the people around you would eventually see the depth of what you were offering and respond in kind. What happened instead was the creation of invisible contracts you never negotiated. Every time you gave without any internal standard of reciprocity, you set a precedent. And precedents, once established, become expectations. And expectations, this is the brutal part, feel like entitlements to the people who hold them. They do not experience gratitude for what you continue to give. They experience irritation at the rare moments you do not. You built a dynamic with your own hands, one generous act at a time, that made your contribution the baseline and your absence the offense. Epictetus understood this from a perspective most of us will never be forced to occupy. As a slave, he had no choice about what he gave, but he observed with extraordinary clarity that the men who commanded the most genuine respect were never the ones who gave the most freely. They were the ones who gave with intention, who made it clear through their bearing and their boundaries that what they offered came from strength and choice, not from fear of what would happen if they stopped. The third way you trained people not to value you is that you performed value instead of inhabiting it. This is the most subtle of the three, and for that reason the most dangerous. You worked harder than most people around you, not to build something real, but to be seen building it. The goal shifted, somewhere along the way, from becoming genuinely valuable to appearing valuable enough that others would confirm it back to you. Marcus Aurelius had a name for this pattern. He called it the actor's disease. The actor's disease is when you begin to live your life as though the audience's reaction determines the quality of your performance, when the applause becomes the point, when the recognition becomes the fuel, when you cannot sustain the work without the validation, because the validation was always the real reason for the work. And here is what that does to you over time. It makes your entire sense of self contingent on variables you cannot control. You become exquisitely sensitive to being overlooked, because being overlooked does not just feel like a social slight. It feels like an existential verdict. It feels like proof of the thing you were most afraid was true. The Stoics diagnosed this with a precision that modern psychology is only now beginning to catch up with. When your value is performed rather than possessed, you cannot project it convincingly, because the people around you, on some level they cannot always articulate, can feel the difference between someone who knows what they are worth and someone who is hoping you will tell them. Authenticity is not a personality trait. It is a structural condition, and it cannot be faked indefinitely, no matter how skilled the performance. What all three of these patterns share is this: they are not signs of weakness. They are signs of a person who cared, deeply, genuinely, sometimes desperately, and did not yet have the tools to direct that care in a way that honored both themselves and the people they were giving it to. That changes now. Chapter 3. The Stoic Method. What actually changes, how people treat you. Everything you have heard up to this point was the diagnosis. Accurate, necessary, and deliberately uncomfortable. But a diagnosis without a cure is just a more sophisticated way of suffering. And the Stoics were never interested in sophisticated suffering. They were interested in transformation, real, measurable, lived transformation that holds up under pressure. Marcus Aurelius did not develop his philosophy in a library. He developed it on campaign, in the rain, surrounded by death, managing betrayal, watching plague move through his empire like a slow fire. Every principle he wrote about was tested in conditions that would have dismantled most people completely. That is not a small thing. That is the entire point. These ideas were not theoretical. They were survival tools, sharpened by reality. What follows is not a list of suggestions, it is a method. And like all genuine methods, it requires practice, not just understanding. You can read every word of this and feel the truth of it and still change nothing, if understanding is all you bring to it. The Stoics were relentless on this point. Philosophy that does not change behavior is decoration, nothing more. The first principle is what Marcus Aurelius called the Internal Citadel. He wrote that inside every human being there exists a place that cannot be touched by circumstance, by other people's opinions, or by the chaos of the external world, but only if you build it deliberately. It does not exist automatically. It is constructed, brick by brick, through the daily practice of deciding who you are before the world has a chance to tell you. Most people begin their day by immediately reaching for external input. They check their phone, they read what others think. They measure the temperature of their social environment before they have even decided what they themselves believe. And in doing so, they hand the first and most important moments of their consciousness over to a world that has no particular interest in building them up. The Stoic practice is the direct inversion of that. Before you interact with a single human being, Before you absorb a single external signal, you answer one question in writing, and you answer it with complete honesty. The question is this: what do I stand for today, regardless of whether anyone notices? Not what do you hope to achieve? Not what do you want others to think of you? What do you stand for? When no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when the room is completely empty. That answer, written down, made concrete, becomes the foundation on which every interaction of your day is built. And over time, with repetition, it becomes the structure other people feel when they encounter you, even when they cannot name what they are feeling. People do not value you because you tell them to. They value you because they can feel, in the way you carry yourself and the way you respond to pressure, that you have already decided you are worth valuing. That decision radiates. It is not invisible, and it changes everything about how a room responds to your presence. The second principle comes from Epictetus, and he called it the discipline of what you offer. Epictetus taught that what is rare commands respect, and what is abundant gets consumed. This is not a social strategy. It is not manipulation. It is one of the most consistent laws of human psychology, observed across every culture and every era without exception. And it applies directly to you, to your time, your attention, your emotional presence, your effort. The practice begins with an honest inventory. Identify the things you give most freely, the things you offer without thought, without condition, without any internal assessment of whether the exchange is sustainable. Now sit with a question that most people are too afraid to answer honestly. What would actually happen if you stopped giving those things without reciprocity? Not as punishment, not as a power game, as an act of self-respect made visible, as the natural consequence of finally treating your own resources with the same care you have been extending to everyone else. When you begin to give with intention rather than anxiety, something shifts in the dynamic almost immediately. Not because you have become cold or withholding or difficult, but because the people around you begin to encounter, perhaps for the first time, the actual weight of what you offer. They begin to feel your presence as a choice rather than a given. And choice by its very nature carries value that inevitability never can. The third principle is what Marcus Aurelius practiced as the discipline of response, and it is perhaps the most immediately transformative of the three. He had a rule, one he returned to constantly throughout the meditations, that between every stimulus and every response, there exists a space. And in that space lives your freedom. Not the freedom to control what happens to you, the freedom to decide who you are in relation to what happens to you. When someone dismissed him, when someone overlooked his counsel or ignored his presence, Marcus Aurelius did not react from the wound. He paused, and in that pause, he asked a question that functioned like a surgical instrument. Is this person's judgment rooted in virtue and reason? If the answer was no, and it usually was, he released the reaction completely, not through suppression, through genuine philosophical assessment. The opinion of someone operating without wisdom carries no more weight than the opinion of someone who has never studied the thing they are judging. You would not ask a person who has never read music to critique your composition. Why would you allow a person operating from ego, insecurity, or indifference to determine your worth? The practice Marcus Aurelius recommended was this: for 7 consecutive days, every time you feel dismissed, overlooked, or undervalued, write down one sentence, like, not about the other person, but about your own reaction. The sentence is this reaction costing me more than the original offense? What you will discover over those 7 days will be one of the most clarifying experiences of your life. You will find, with a consistency that is almost shocking, that the original dismissal cost you seconds, and your reaction to it cost you hours, sometimes days. The wound was real but small. The infection was self-administered, and that discovery, that precise, documented, undeniable discovery, is where your power begins to return to you. Because what is self-administered can be self-interrupted. What you learn to do automatically, you can learn to do deliberately. The Stoics staked their entire philosophy on that single conviction, and 2,000 years of human experience have yet to prove them wrong. These three principles do not work in isolation, and they do not work instantly. They work the way all genuine transformation works, through repetition, through failure, through returning to the practice after you have abandoned it, through the slow accumulation of a different kind of evidence about who you are. But they work. Tested by a slave and an emperor in conditions neither of them chose, against pressures neither of them could fully control. If it held for them, it will hold for you. Chapter 4. The price of being truly valued. What no one tells you. There is something that has to be said here before we go any further, that most people in this conversation will deliberately avoid saying, because it is uncomfortable, because it complicates the narrative, because it asks something of you that goes beyond practice and discipline and philosophical method. It asks something of your courage at a level that none of the previous chapters required. When you apply everything you have learned, when you build the internal citadel, when you begin to give with intention rather than anxiety, when you insert the pause between stimulus and response, and stop handing your worth over to people who never earned the right to hold it, something will happen that no one warned you about. People will leave. Not all of them, but some of them. And some of those people will be people you love, people you have known for years, people whose presence in your life felt so permanent that the idea of their absence never even registered as a possibility. They will leave, not because you became worse, not because you failed, not because you did something wrong, but because the version of you they were most comfortable with was the version that needed them in a way you no longer will. The relationships that were built on your hunger for approval cannot survive your freedom from it. This is not a theory. This is what happens. Marcus Aurelius experienced it. As he deepened his Stoic practice, as he became more rooted in his internal citadel and less dependent on the validation of the people around him, the nature of his relationships changed completely. Some people drew closer, drawn by the gravity of someone who had found genuine ground to stand on. Others drifted, or were pushed, to the edges of his life, because the dynamic they had relied upon had ceased to exist. Epictetus lost the comfort of invisibility when he stopped being convenient. There is a particular kind of social safety in being underestimated, in being overlooked, in being the person everyone takes for granted, because at least you know what to expect. When you step out of that role, when you begin to occupy your actual size in a room, the people who benefited from your smallness will not celebrate your growth. They will resist it, sometimes quietly, sometimes not. Seneca understood this at a cost that dwarfs anything most of us will ever be asked to pay. He spent decades as an advisor, a mentor, a philosopher of extraordinary influence, and was ultimately sentenced to death by the student he had loved and guided most closely, Nero, a man Seneca had shaped in part through his own teaching. The price of being genuinely himself, of refusing to dissolve his integrity into the service of someone else's ego, was absolute. That is an extreme. Your version of this will almost certainly not look like that. But the principle it illustrates is one the Stoics return to again and again with a kind of unflinching honesty that is rare in any era. Becoming truly valued is not a universally comfortable process. It will cost you something. And you need to know that before you begin, because if you do not know it the first time someone pulls away in response to your growth, you will interpret it as evidence that the method failed, when in fact it is evidence that the method is working. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in the Meditations that took on a different weight every time he returned to it throughout his life. He wrote that the object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. What he meant by that, beneath the philosophical language, is that the consensus of the crowd is not a reliable measure of truth, of value, or of the right direction to move. Most people are operating from the same unexamined conditioning you are in the process of dismantling. Their comfort with your old self is not a recommendation. It is a description of what served them. The Stoics had a concept they called sympatheia, the interconnectedness of all things, the idea that nothing in the universe exists in true isolation. But they balanced that concept with something equally important, the understanding that connection built on false foundations is not connection at all. It is mutual dependency dressed in the language of relationship, And when you dissolve the false foundation, when you stop being who you were not in order to be accepted, you do not destroy real connection. You make room for it, perhaps for the first time. What remains after that pruning is something the Stoics considered among the most precious things a human life could contain. Relationships grounded in reality, in who you actually are, in what you genuinely offer, given freely from a place of strength rather than extracted from a place of fear. People who value you not because you have made yourself impossible to leave, not because you have performed yourself into their good graces, but because they encountered the real thing and recognized it. Those relationships are rare. The Stoics knew that. They did not pretend otherwise. Marcus Aurelius could count on one hand the people in his life he considered genuinely trustworthy, and he was one of the most powerful men who had ever lived. But he also wrote with a clarity that cuts across 2 millennia that one real thing is worth more than 1,000 comfortable illusions. You are not losing people when this happens. You are losing the illusion that those particular connections were what you thought they were. And underneath that loss, which is real, which deserves to be grieved, there is something solid waiting for you. Something that does not shift depending on how convenient you are being. Something that holds. That is what the Stoics were building toward. Not popularity, not universal approval, not a life in which everyone sees your value and responds accordingly. A life in which you know your value so completely, so structurally, so independently of external confirmation, that the ones who cannot see it simply become irrelevant, not through bitterness, not through walls, but through the quiet and unshakable fact that their opinion no longer has access to the place where your worth lives. That place is yours. It always was. You just had not built it yet. Chapter 5. The Letter. Marcus Aurelius never sent. There is a particular kind of silence that comes after a real conversation. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something that has settled, shifted into place after a long time of being misaligned. If you have stayed with this until now, you are sitting inside that silence, and it deserves to be honored before we close. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations across years of campaign, grief, and governance, always in Greek, his chosen language of philosophical precision, always in the second person, always addressed to himself. Not to posterity, not to students, not to history, to himself. As a man who understood that the hardest person to speak honestly with is always the one looking back at you from the mirror, he never sent those words to anyone. He never intended to. They were a private reckoning, the ongoing correspondence between the man he was and the man he was committed to becoming. And yet those private words outlasted his empire, his dynasty, every political structure he spent his life maintaining. They outlasted everything external about him, because they were the only thing he built that was genuinely internal. What follows is not a quotation from the Meditations. It is something different. It is what I believe Marcus Aurelius would have written, not as a philosopher constructing arguments, not as an emperor issuing counsel, but as a human being who had walked the full length of this road and wanted to leave something true at the end of it for the person who would come after him, for you. He would have written it something like this: You have spent long enough measuring yourself against the silence of people who were never qualified to assess you. You have handed the verdict on your worth to judges who had not read the evidence, who had not sat with you long enough to understand what they were evaluating, who were too occupied with their own unexamined fears to see you clearly. And you accepted those verdicts, not because you were weak, because you were human, and humans are built to seek the mirror of other eyes. But you are reading this now, which means something in you already knew that mirror was distorted. Something in you resisted the verdict long enough to keep looking. That resistance, quiet, persistent, sometimes exhausted, is not stubbornness. It is the voice of your actual nature, refusing to be permanently misidentified. The Stoics did not promise you that the world would recognize what you built inside yourself. They promised you something better, that once you built it, the world's recognition would become optional, not irrelevant, not something to be scorned or dismissed. Simply optional, the difference between a gift and a requirement, between something that pleases you when it arrives and something that destroys you when it does not. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not the sum of every moment someone looked through you as though you were not there. You are the sum of every moment you chose to remain, to keep caring, to keep showing up, to keep reaching for something real, even when the evidence around you suggested it was not worth reaching for. That is not a small thing. Marcus Aurelius, in all his years of writing to himself in the dark, never stopped being moved by the human capacity to continue, to absorb loss and disappointment and invisibility, and still choose the next morning to try again. He considered it among the most profound expressions of the rational soul, this refusal to be permanently defeated by circumstances that were never within your control to begin with. What changes now is not the world. The world will remain largely what it has always been, indifferent to your internal architecture, responsive to what you project, shaped by forces that have nothing to do with your merit. What changes is your relationship to all of that. What changes is the place from which you meet it. You stop waiting for permission. You stop performing for an audience that was never going to give you the verdict you needed, because that verdict was never theirs to give. You begin, slowly and then with increasing certainty, to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. And that shift, subtle at first, tectonic over time, is what the Stoics spent their entire lives pointing toward. Not a destination, a direction, not a moment of arrival, a way of moving through every moment that follows this one. Marcus Aurelius never sent that letter, but he lived it. Imperfectly, inconsistently, with failures and retreats and long stretches where the philosophy must have felt impossibly distant from the reality he was navigating. He lived it anyway, and at the end of a life that demanded more of him than almost any human life has ever demanded, what remained was not the empire, not the victories, not the titles. What remained were the words he wrote to himself in private, the evidence of a man who chose again and again to build inward when everything around him was collapsing outward. That choice is available to you. It was always available to you. The only thing that was ever standing between you and it was the belief that you needed someone else to tell you it was yours to make. You do not. You never did. Begin.